Okay, so let's get started today. We're going to talk about contract closing. So going over the contract to closing process, the whole thing from top to bottom. So when you first get under contract, what's the very first thing that you do? Well, I think what you need to do is communicate to everybody involved, number one. So talk to the lender, the attorney, the other agent, your client. And one of the best ways to do that is a simple email. All right. So very first thing, contract to closing, as soon as you get that contract validated by everybody, signed by everybody, immediately send the contract in one email to your client, the lender, and the attorney. All right. We're going to pretty much look at contract to closing from the buyer's perspective, buyer agent perspective. There's a little bit more going on that, but we'll talk about seller side here as well. Okay, so you send an email copying attorney, your client, and the lender all in the same email, and saying something like, "Hey Joe, so excited for you. We got the contract signed by everybody. Next step, we'll have to look into getting our due diligence started, and so talk with your lender. Make sure you're getting everything done that they're asking of you." Next paragraph. "Hey, Mrs. Attorney, just want to let you know we've got a new contract. It's for this property. The client is so-and-so. Closing date is estimated at X date. We look forward to working with you. Attached, you'll find the contract to get started with. Thanks, looking forward to working with you." Next paragraph. "Hey, lender, Joe just got under contract on this property. We're excited about it. Just wanted to let you know, here's the property address. Attached, you'll find the contract. Please get with Joe as soon as possible to get things solidified on the loan and get the appraisal ordered." Okay, so assigning or sending that email to everybody at the same time is really helpful so that it's all there for everybody to see at the exact same time. Okay, so that's the very first thing you should do. Now, once we go under contract, we got to look at the due diligence time, right? What's going to happen in due diligence? So whatever the buyer's wanting to do, if the buyer wants to do inspections, great. Buyer wants to do an appraisal, surveys, septic inspections, well inspections, electrical inspection, HVAC inspection, whatever, now's the time to get that started, all right? So we're going to look at a document, the professional services disclosure and election form, that will help guide you through that process, okay? So before we do that though, I want to give you the number one tip for contract to closing. Ready? Number one tip, by far the most important thing: communicate, communicate, communicate with everybody involved. All right, communicate constantly with everyone that's in the transaction. So what do I mean by that? Oh, okay, Aaron, communicate, but what does that mean? Well, for me, when I was selling and had a lot under contract, the way I was able to keep up with it all and still stay in good communication with everyone was for every day to pull out the file. Let me see, like I've just got a file from my, sorry, on Zoom, that looks a little weird. A file like this, manila folder from a box, right? Sorry. Box looks just like this, right? I've used these for years and years. You've got all the different files in them. Every day for your under contracts, pull it out, contact somebody on that, okay? Now this file here is one from just a potential buyer. There's not much written on there yet, but other ones from deals that are now under contract look a whole lot more in depth. Okay, so again, you go through that folder and you write down who you're talking to and when. So maybe today you talk to the lender and say, "Hey, lender, do you have what you need from the buyer right now?" That's it. That's all you send. You send in a text, email, call, whatever. I like doing that stuff early in the morning or late at night because you can send an email and just say, "Hey, how you doing with this file? Do you need anything from me?" and move on to the next file. So it takes less than a minute per file to really stay on top of it. Because today you talk to the lender, then maybe tomorrow you're emailing your client, and the next day you're emailing the attorney. And usually those emails need to be nothing more than, hey, just checking in on you. Are we good on everything? That's all it needs to be. All right. You know, it's obviously sometimes you'll have more to talk about. You'll have something more to discuss. But if you don't know, I don't know what I should say today. Great. Email somebody, text somebody, say, hey, do you need anything from me on this file? All right. That'll keep you up to date on things and really help solve potential problems that will show themselves down the road. Okay. So that's the number one rule. Communicate constantly with everybody. Again, if you just touch each file one time a day, one person a day, you don't need a contract to closing coordinator. You can do that by yourself. If you've got 60 under contracts, congratulations, a lot under contract. 60 under contracts would take you about an hour, probably less, probably 45 minutes. So if you got 60 under contracts, you want to get up at 4 in the morning, you're done by 5 in the morning. All your contract closing stuff is done. And all you're doing the rest of the day is responding to emails on those things. All right. So I hate to see when agents have 1 or 2 or, you know, even 4, 5, 6 deals under contract and like, oh my gosh, I need a contract to closing coordinator. No, you don't. No, you don't. All right. You need 10, 15 minutes a day and you're good to go. Just it's a consistent talking to everybody. If you stop talking to them and then you got to come back in a week or 2 weeks and catch up with everybody, yeah, now it's taking a little while. Okay. All right. So anyway, that's the number one tip. Okay. So let's go ahead. I'm going to share my screen a little bit here. And let's take a look at .loop. And we'll look at the professional services disclosure. All right. So on this form, this is what we use to work through our due diligence time period and make sure that we're ordering everything for our buyer client, or that they're ordering it, making sure we know who's ordering what and then what we're ordering. So for each person, taking a look at the home warranty, HVAC inspections, insurance. So use this form as your guide to what do we need to see about getting done now that we're in due diligence, okay? And the number one delay in closing is because of the lender, and it's not usually the lender's fault. People always blame the lender, but it's not usually the lender's fault. It's usually the buyer not getting the paperwork to the lender in time. Maybe the agent not getting the paperwork to the lender in time, okay? So get on your lender about contacting your client about the paperwork. Get on your buyer about taking what the lender asked for and get it done right away. Don't delay on it. Don't wait 2 weeks to get them all that paperwork. Get it done the next day. We know it's a problem. I mean, we know it's a hassle, but they just need to do it, okay? It's part of buying a house. All right, so the rest of the stuff, you're gonna go over this with your buyer client. And you know, usually a CPA, maybe not, maybe they don't need one. But if they're doing a 1031 tax exchange or something, they probably do need a CPA, right? So ask about that. An appraisal, usually the lender is going to order that. So the lender orders over here. But if it's a cash deal, they may choose to get one. They can select it, or they may not. And it's just as important that they waive it as if they select it, as far as yourself and making sure that you've disclosed to them what their options are and that they can initial that, yeah, I do want to waive this, and they initial that, okay? So what attorney are we working with? Home warranty company, inspections. What kind of inspection are we getting? A regular home inspection? Do they want an additional HVAC inspection? Well, Aaron, I thought the HVAC was covered in the home inspection. It is to a point. They will turn it on and make sure it's working, but they won't inspect the system. So you do have to schedule a separate HVAC inspection for that. All right, so if you do, then that HVAC contractor come out, they actually open up the system, look at all the coils in there. You know, it can still blow hot air, but maybe it's not working properly. Maybe one of the coils is out, or it's on emergency heat, and that's why it's blowing hot, but that's not what it's supposed to be doing. So that's a very important inspection to have on a lot of homes. So make sure that they know that and they're either accepting that or they're waiving it. It's got a pool or a spa, radon inspection, right? A radon inspection, usually the home inspectors can do that as well. It's an additional about $100 or so to do that. Are they going to get a septic inspection? They're going to get a well inspection, a pest inspection, termite inspection, etc. Okay. So any of these things, make sure we're getting those ordered. And there's also a couple of blanks down here. Maybe there's something else that we want to get ordered. All right. So make sure we're looking at all of those options. All right. So who should they use for home inspections, septic inspections? Well, that's where we have our gold service providers, right? So the gold service providers are people that we think do a good job, people that we know, like, and trust, maybe have some leverage with. And what we mean by leverage is just simply that we know them, we give them a lot of business, so they treat our clients extra special, and so it just really helps to ensure good service. Okay, so you can always use those. You can always talk to us and see who we would recommend for something. But use that professional services disclosure form to really make sure you're asking your client about all of those different options. Okay, let's talk about the inspections themselves. Most home inspectors have a license with the MLS and the Board of Realtors to be able to open up the Sentry lock boxes. So most of them can get to the house, open the box and the key without you having to be there. You do not have to be there as a real estate agent. However, you can be, and you can be with your client. However, it's against our Board of Ethics to let the client be there without you. So if your client's going to be there, then you should be there. Okay. I would recommend that you plan on coming towards the end of the home inspection to walk through the house with the home inspector, and he can kind of show you what's going on with the house. I wouldn't recommend, or at least I wouldn't personally try to be there for the whole home inspection. Why? Well, I don't want to be. I don't want to sit there for 3 hours while the home inspector walks through the house. That's probably the biggest reason. But number two, like, there's nothing you can really do. You really shouldn't go to the home inspector and start pointing things out to him and showing him, hey, I want you to inspect this, want to inspect that. That really causes a problem liability-wise for you. So you really shouldn't be involved in that process anyway. And so really the only advantage of being there is so that you can kind of visually see what's going on with the inspection and maybe what the issues are. The reports are so good now with the pictures and descriptions that you really don't even have to be there to get a really good idea of what's going on, but it can be helpful. All right. And again, like I said, it's really just if the buyer wants to be there, then you should be there. And same thing for the buyer. If they want to be there, I would really recommend that they plan on coming towards the end of the inspection just to do a walkthrough with the inspector, point out the major items. It doesn't do them any good either to stand there for 3 hours. And the home inspector doesn't love it if the buyer's standing over him for 3 hours, right? Okay. All right. So once the home inspection is completed, there could be some items that the buyer wants the seller to repair. So how do you do that? Well, and first of all, you should prepare your buyer that every home inspection is going to come back with 30, 40 items. They just are. So you should prepare them that it's going to be a lengthy report, and even if it has 30, 40 items, that doesn't mean it's a bad house. It means it's a normal house and there's some issues that need to be fixed. But a lot of those issues are things like a broken outlet cover or something really small. We're not concerned about those. We're concerned about major things like the HVAC is not working properly, or the electrical panel has some safety issues, or there's no GFCIs near the sink, like some issues that are safety involved that maybe should be repaired. So those are some of the issues that we want to take a look at and have repaired. The buyer does not have to ask for any repairs. I would advise clients not to ask for a ton of repairs, especially the little items. Just asking for the items that maybe you were surprised by, items that you thought the HVAC was working properly and it's not. So those are the things that I typically would be asking for as the buyer or the buyer's agent. I should suspect there's going to be a lot of small things wrong with every house, right? So once we decide on what those items are, then we need to come up with a due diligence request. I typically would recommend waiting until you have all reports, all information before making a request, officially making a request. However, I get the question a lot of times, people say, well, look, we have the home inspection back. We know there's a few issues here. However, we still have, okay, sorry about that. We still have, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Okay, so oh yeah, we still have outstanding inspection with maybe radon or pest or something like that. Should we let the buyer or the seller know that we found some pretty big issues on the home inspection? And my theory would be, yeah, you should let them know, but maybe not officially on a due diligence request, okay? You could do that as well, but let me say this too. You don't have just one chance at a due diligence request. You can make several requests. You can have 100 different due diligence request forms filled out. Wouldn't recommend it, but you could. But you definitely could have one and then something else comes up and you have another, right? But it's really a bad idea to go about it that way, because you think about it from the seller's perspective. You negotiate with them and they give in and they agree to fix these things, and then you come up with another issue. Can you imagine how that feels as a seller? So I'd really prefer to make one request if possible. Certainly time will come where you have to make a second one. It is what it is. But in that case, when you know, maybe they did the home inspection report and maybe we know the HVAC had a major issue or the roof was really bad or something big that we know we're going to have to ask for and it's a deal breaker, I would prefer to make a verbal request, or at least a shot over the bow, a warning to that seller, just a simple call to the agent saying, hey, look, we're not going to make an official request yet because we're still waiting on a radon report, inspection, termite report, something like that. However, the home inspection did reveal that the roof needed to be replaced. That is going to be something we're going to be asking for. So if you all want to start getting quotes on that, that could be a good use of time while we're waiting for the inspection. There's just kind of a shot over the bow, making sure that they're aware of it. It tends to go a lot better that way than if you just broadside them with a full request. All right. So I would definitely recommend that if possible. Okay, sorry, I had to jump off for just a second there, but to continue our conversation, so yeah, you want to make sure that they have the, all the inspections back. You're making that request, and maybe just give them that warning, okay, that something's coming. Then you can kind of put it in writing and fill it all out at that point, okay? So how do you make a due diligence request? Let's go back here to .loop. On the due diligence request form, there's a big blank for you to fill out all kinds of stuff. And the problem is we're not allowed to, right? We're not allowed to fill in this blank with whatever we want. So the form's pretty simple. The buyer name, seller name, address, the request, and then number 2 here, the buyer does or does not agree to release all the inspection reports. I would recommend that they do release them. There's no reason not to. Buyers sometimes get finicky about that and say, well, I don't want to release a report because the seller might use it. Like, who cares? It's on that house. Like, what are you going to do with it? So I just recommend that they do release the reports. It certainly helps you get a yes from the seller because they can more easily see the issues that are at hand. So how do we make the request? Well, again, when the contract's between a buyer and a seller, you as the agent are not allowed to write whatever we want in here, thus becoming an attorney. So we can't do that. So there's a couple things though that we can do. One, you can have the buyer or the seller write whatever they want in here, or text it to you, email it to you. You can copy and paste it in here, right? The other option is to take what's on the inspection report and just say the items listed on the inspection report. So say something like per inspection report by Joe Inspector, items 1.4, 5.6, 8.7, okay, just as an example. So those item numbers are listed on the general summary of the inspection report, 1.2, 1.4, 5.6, 8.7, whatever they are. And then that has the paragraph and pictures and everything else that's going on with that situation. So now this isn't in your words, it's in the inspector's words. So this is commonly what we will put into the contract, all right, or into the request. So just listing the item numbers is what I would recommend there. What if there's something that's not in the item numbers? Well, then we're going to have to write it in here, but again, not you, but the buyer or the seller. So have the buyer write what they want to put in there, and we can copy and paste it in, okay? Oftentimes, buyers will be okay with just simply doing a closing costs, maybe asking for $2,000 in closing costs instead of doing the repairs, because maybe they'd prefer to make the repairs themselves. Maybe the seller would prefer that the buyer makes them after closing. So how do we do that? Well, you can still do this here, and then you could add in there something like $2,000 in buyer closing costs paid by seller in lieu of repairs. Okay, so we could do something like that. But if we do that, this is not enough. Okay, this isn't the actual contract. It's a request and agreement. So what we do in that case, we still can use this form. And then in addition to it, we want to use 4T. All right, 4T being our agreement to amend contract. And so we can use this form right here, and then we just put in the expenses or change from 0 to 2,000, something like that. All right, and we have buyer name, property address, buyer signs, seller signs. We're all good to go. All right, so that's oftentimes what will happen. It's sometimes just the seller's out of town, the seller's busy getting ready to pack up and move. They don't want to make the repairs. And logically, if you think about it, a seller that's moving out of the house and is just making the repairs to satisfy the buyer so that we can close, they're not going to be super motivated to hire the best contractor, do the best job. They're just kind of trying to do the bare minimum. And we might think, well, you know, people wouldn't do that. Well, they do all the time. So we want to make sure that everyone's protected. And so oftentimes it's better for the buyer just to make the repairs. But sometimes the seller's willing to make them. And we're great, that's wonderful. Sometimes the buyer has to have them made in order for the lender to make the loan. Fine, we will make the repairs. But it is not uncommon for people to use this form where we add expenses or we reduce the purchase price of the home. Okay, so that's often how that is done. All right. Now, next, let's talk about the appraisals. So appraisals are going to be ordered by the lender. If it's a cash deal, they would be ordered by you, the agent, or the buyer. They don't have to do an appraisal if it's a cash purchase. However, and most cash buyers won't do an appraisal. but they have the option to, okay? But again, if it's a loan, the appraisal is going to be ordered by the lender, and they often don't have any say in who that appraiser is. So they will usually just put in an order online, and then it gets automatically selected and the appraiser goes out. Usually the only way you're going to know who the appraiser is because that appraiser has to make an appointment to show the home. And so usually the listing agent will be the first to know who the appraiser is because they're getting the appointments, okay? So what happens if it doesn't go well? What happens if the appraisal comes back and say we're under contract for $300,000 and it comes back at $290,000? Appraiser says, hey, it's worth $290,000. What options do we have? Well, the buyer can choose to buy the house for $300,000, knowing the appraisal is only $290,000. If it's got a loan, the lender's only going to make a loan based off the $290,000 number. So if their loan is 80% of the value and it's a $300,000 home, then they're only going to, I'm sorry, it's $290,000 appraisal, they're only going to lend 80% of that $290,000, not 80% of the $300,000, right? So the difference, the $10,000 difference, the buyer would have to come up with their 20% of $290,000 plus $10,000, and they could still do that loan. Lenders won't care if they do that, but they will only be able to do it in that manner. So what if the buyer doesn't want to do that? Well, seller can choose to reduce the price to the $290,000 number, or there could be a compromise. Maybe seller says, we'll reduce it to $295,000, but not any different. The buyer can back out for any reason up until the due diligence date, right? So the buyer can back out if they don't like the appraisal number, but what if we're after the due diligence date? Well, the buyer would not be able to back out because of an appraisal at this point without losing their earnest money. There are, of course, some ifs and ands and buts to that. FHA loans, VA loans will have an additional addendum about the appraisal value, etc. There's always an if and an and and a but to everything in real estate, okay? But those can be negotiated. The appraisals can be negotiated if, if it doesn't come in where we need it to. It's just another conversation that needs to get had, and sometimes it just doesn't work out. Sometimes buyer just can't buy the property. It's also possible if the loan is, the appraisal is really bad and we just don't think it's an accurate appraisal. Sometimes you can ask the lender to order another appraisal. Sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. If they won't, the buyer does have the option to go ahead and switch lenders. Sometimes that has to happen in order to get a more fair appraisal. So each situation is a little different, but those are the basic options. All right. So you work through all of that. Again, you're communicating the whole time, right? So you're talking to the lender, you're talking to the attorney, you're talking to the buyer, talking to the listing agent. The whole time you're talking through all of that. Once those repairs that we've asked for, let's say the seller agreed to make them, once those repairs are done, then the buyer should re-inspect. They can do that by hiring the inspector to come back and do a re-inspection. They could go out with you and do it themselves. They could do whatever they want. The one thing I don't want you doing is you going out and you inspecting it. You could go out and take some pictures, take some video, send those to them, but I don't want you going out there taking a look and say, yeah, it looks good to me, because you've just basically taken all liability on for that repair. All right, so get reports, get receipts if they hired contractors, get warranties from the contractors, whatever you can get, and give that to the buyer, but you just don't want to make an opinion on whether this was done correctly or not, okay? But again, you can take video, pictures, whatever, to help them out if they're out of town. You just can't give an opinion that it looks good or not. All right, as we move closer to closing, one thing you really need to do is make sure that you are giving the buyer an opportunity to do a walkthrough. Now, a walkthrough is just that. It's a walkthrough. It's not another inspection. It's not another showing. It's a walkthrough. We're just making sure that the house hasn't burned down and that the seller hasn't got a hole in the wall from dropping the couch down the stairs or something like that. That stuff happens. We have had properties where the homes actually did have a fire, did burn down, and so it happens. It's not often, but it happens. So you want to make sure that we give that opportunity for the walkthrough. The walkthrough should happen the day of closing. Sometimes it'll happen the day right before closing, but definitely do the walkthrough. If the buyer doesn't want to do one, that's fine. Get the professional services disclosure out, have them initial that they do not want to do a walkthrough. All right, it's very important that we do that. All right, and then the last thing really is closing. You get to the closing table, and really at that point, your job is just to ensure that the numbers and everything looks correct. The attorneys are going to handle closing. You should be double checking the settlement statement, making sure the numbers are right. A lot of times where we get off is like maybe there's an amendment for closing costs and nobody got that to the attorney. And so the attorney is not aware of that, and maybe we have to catch that at the closing. Shouldn't happen if we're doing our communication the right way, but we're all imperfect, so things like that will happen, and as long as we catch it, it's no big deal really. Okay, so make sure that you're looking over all the settlement statements and have all the numbers. But essentially at the closing table, you basically just be quiet, let the attorney handle their business. You're there for support, double checking the numbers, and also to be there for support for your client and asking for referrals from your client. We can bring them a closing gift if you want. At our office now, we've got our own brand of coffee. Maybe you want to bring them a thing of coffee in a coffee mug or something like that. You can bring them something and make them feel good, and it's a good time usually, because people are usually very happy at the closing table. So that's really all you're doing there at closing. Again, one thing I'm just thinking of on the walkthrough, how do you get the keys to the buyer client? Well, you're not supposed to give keys to the buyer until the closing is recorded at the courthouse, but you can often get permission from the seller and the listing agent to go ahead and give the keys to the buyer at closing, but you do need permission to do that. So oftentimes I will ask the listing agent, hey, can I just take the keys from the walkthrough and then give them to the buyer at closing? And usually they'll say yes. Sometimes they say no, and that's their choice, that's fine. And we just have to usually just leave them at the closing attorney's office, or you can keep them and then meet up with the buyer later to give it to them. Okay. But yeah, that's about it. Contract to closing, there's usually a lot more little details that pop up here and there, but that's the basic process in it. So I hope you find that helpful, and if you got any questions, just let us know.